In this lesson, I'm going to discuss how to answer a 25-mark question from paper 3 of the Edexcel A-level paper. As you may agree, most students find this to be the hardest paper and one of the hardest questions in the paper for two reasons. One, it requires students to apply both microeconomic and macroeconomic concepts. And two, it's a long-form essay question, which I find especially a lot of Korean students don't really know how to structure their answers properly. So hopefully this is of some help. Now the question that I'm going to discuss today is, with reference to the information provided and your own knowledge, evaluate the possible microeconomic and macroeconomic effects on the UK economy of a decision by the government to encourage fracking. Now when it comes to these 25 markers, I always follow a 4-part structure, and we're going to go through them one by one. Now the first part of the structure is introduction and definitions. Here we're going to talk about what we're going to write the essay about and a conclusion for it, as well as the definitions that we need to discuss the topic at hand. Now we're going to try and keep this very short so we don't waste too much time here. So I'm just going to make 3 points. Firstly, that we're going to be discussing the possible micro and macroeconomic effects on the UK economy of a decision to encourage fracking. In other words, we're re-clarifying the question. Secondly, we're going to discuss what fracking actually is. Now the definition is given in the long reading before, and it's defined as extracting oil from shale to sell it to the UK market in general. So we'll put that definition there. And thirdly, we're going to write a conclusion. It's going to be short. I'm just going to say, in conclusion, I will find through this essay that the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of encouraging fracking is generally positive for the UK economy. Now, the reason that I write the conclusion in the introduction is that I find a lot of students run out of time when they're doing these 25 markers, and they rush it towards the end and they forget about it. However, the mark scheme actually specifically states that candidates should make informed judgments at the end. So I always like to do it at the introduction and get it over and done with so we can secure the marks. Now that we've done the introduction and definitions, we're going to be doing the next 2 parts of our 4-part structure. Now obviously these parts are going to be micro and macro analyses. Now when it comes to each of these parts, I like to follow a very set, rigid formula so that you can apply it to pretty much any 25 marker there is. Now the formula is as follows. Firstly, you have an analysis, which always involves a model of some kind. And then you have 2 substantive evaluation points, if preferable on the model itself. Now, let's go through a micro analysis, micro part for this question in particular. Now, fracking is going to allow gas companies to extract cheap shale gas and sell it to the UK market for companies and consumers to consume. Now, shale gas is a form of energy, and energy is one of the key components of factors of productions for pretty much all firms there are, specifically in the form of transport, heating, or electricity, etc., etc. In other words, fracking is going to reduce the costs of production for many UK firms. Now we can introduce a model, the model of supply and demand of a firm in the UK economy. Now, a reduction in the cost of production is going to lead to a shift in the supply curve outwards to the right. This is because the company is essentially going to be able to produce more units of the good at every price level as the cost of production is lower. So that's shown by a shift from S to S2, which is shown in blue. Now, this leads to a reduction in the price of the good from P1 to P2 and an increase in the quantity consumed of the good at equilibrium point from Q1 to Q2. Now, never end your analysis just there. What's really important is to talk about the effects on surplus of consumers and producers from the new change. So let's look at producer surplus first. Producer surplus was originally shown by this triangle here in yellow, and it's the aggregate of the difference between the equilibrium price and what the producer would have been willing to produce at. At the new supply curve, it increases to this triangle here. Now, what about consumer surplus? Consumer surplus was originally this triangle here. And this is the aggregate of the equilibrium price and the price that individual consumers would have been willing to pay for that good. Now, due to the shift in the supply curve, this has increased to this triangle here. So we find that producer and consumer surplus has both increased. By how much? Well, we call this the net economic benefit, and this is shown by this green triangle here. By this amount here, the economy as a whole is better off. Now, let's talk about the evaluative points. The first evaluative point that I'd like to talk about is the effects that fracking will have on other producers of energy. Now, shale gas is going to be a substitute good for other forms of energy such as coal, nuclear, or solar and wind energy. So these firms are actually going to be worse off. By how much? Well, that depends on this cross-elasticity of demand. Via the cross-elasticity of demand, as the price of shale gas decreases, the demand of consumers for these other forms of energy will decrease. Now, you can show this through another supply and demand diagram if you want, but I don't think it's quite necessary. What's important is to explain that this is going to be shown through a shift in the demand curve to the left. And in that sense, those producers are going to be worse off because their producer surplus is going to decrease. And this is, of course, referenced in the information and data that we're given as well, in terms of how solar producers are going to be worse off. So try and refer to that if possible. And while you're talking about it, I always like to try and suggest a solution as well, especially because our conclusion is going to be that the net effects of fracking is going to be positive. So you might say that to counteract this effect on other producers, especially those of renewable energy producers, the government might tax fracking production and then use that to subsidize renewable energy development, because that's going to lead to a long-term investment in a more clean energy. Now, the second evaluative point that I'd like to talk about is externalities. Now, of course, externalities is alluded to in the information and data that we're given as well. Always try and look at the information data that we're given for hints as to evaluative points which you could discuss. So I'm quite sure the information and data that we're given discusses the effects of pollution, the effects of pollution on the water supply from fracking. And those are, of course, negative externalities. Now, again, you can do another diagram of demand and supply, which shows these negative externalities, but I don't think it's necessary, and don't do it unless you really have the time. But the point is that as fracking increases shale gas production and consumption, the externalities, the negative externalities which are related to that, will also increase. So we might be facing more pollution, more issues with water, and the health concerns which are related to water supply. And this is of course a market failure. Now, again, we should try and discuss how the government might intervene and try to solve this. Now, the government, of course, can try and internalize these externalities by things such as quotas or more tax on the fracking, which will internalize the externalities to the producers of shale gas. Now, of course, this is going to be a difficult task for the government because it's very hard to monetize exactly the value of these externalities such as pollution or water supply issues. And if the government prices these things wrong, prices the effects of these externalities wrong, it might lead to an even worse outcome, and we call that government failure. Now, let's talk about the macro part now. Now, because energy is a factor of production which affects nearly all firms, as we discussed through transport, heating and electricity, we would find that the cost of production for pretty much all firms in the UK are going to be reduced in the aggregate if enough shale gas is produced and if it's cheap enough. In other words, aggregate supply is going to shift outwards. And of course, this is where we introduce the Keynesian ADAS diagram. Now, as with the microeconomic diagram facing firms, the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right as the costs of production decrease in the aggregate. So we show that through a shift from AS to A2. Now, similar as before, this is going to lead to a decrease in the general price level from P1 to P2, in other words, deflation, and an increase in the general output, the aggregate output of the economy, from Y1 to Y2, in other words, economic growth. Now, again, don't just end the discussion there. It's important to discuss why these things are important. Well, let's talk about inflation. The government has a stated aim of keeping inflation to below 2% in the UK, and if the price level decreases in general, then it might help the government in keeping to that aim of keeping inflation below 2%. Same with output. Economic growth is one of the stated aims of the UK government and pretty much all governments in general. An increase in economic output from Y1 to Y2 is the exact type of economic growth that the UK government is seeking. And of course, economic growth is also related to employment. As the general output of the economy increases, we would find that more people are employed. And of course, this is actually in the information and data that we're given. I believe it says the UK economy might benefit from 30,000 or 35,000 extra jobs. So refer to that as well, and how that's an aim of the government, and thus why the effects of fracking might be positive for the macroeconomic sense as well. Now for the evaluative points. The first point that I'd like to discuss is the degree to which fracking might benefit the UK economy in general might be a lot less than how beneficial it was for the USA. And that, I believe, is because the UK economy isn't as dependent on manufacturing, and it's much more service oriented and also financially oriented than the US. Because these industries in the UK aren't as dependent on energy for their costs, we might find that fracking and the introduction of cheap shale gas into the market doesn't increase aggregate supply as much as it does in the US. So we might find that the benefits are not as great. The second point that I'd like to talk about is that the exact extent to which this increase in aggregate supply benefits the UK economy depends on the position of the UK economy beforehand. For example, if the UK economy was severely demand deficient before the introduction of shale gas, you would find that aggregate supply increases do not actually lead to actual increases in output or even a reduction in price. I'll show this in the model here briefly, but don't feel the need to do this during the exam, as it's very costly in terms of time and might not be worth that time in terms of marks. But let's say the aggregate supply curve is down here. Let's say that the original aggregate demand curve was here. It's a very severely demand deficient state of affairs. We find that even though aggregate supply has increased from AS to A2, along the same demand curve, there's actually no increase in output or decrease in price. So the exact extent to which aggregate supply increases will benefit the UK economy depends on the state of the UK economy beforehand. Now the final part to this 4-part structure for 25 markers is the conclusion. Now for me, this is actually much more of a formality because I've already stated that the effects are going to be mostly positive microeconomically and macroeconomically in the introduction. So I should have already banked these marks which are available for that informed judgment. But nonetheless, just to make sure that the examiners don't miss this, I have a very short 2 or 3 sentences on the conclusion. And I usually do this by saying the micro and macroeconomic effects in general of fracking are going to be positive as shown above. There are possible negative downsides as shown in the evaluative points. However, the government can intervene and possibly successfully mitigate these negative points and maximize the benefits from fracking. I hope this has been of some help for you, and I hope to see you in a lesson quite soon. Thanks.